Before we begin, a mandatory disclaimer for our audience. The following story is a work of fiction for entertainment purposes. Although set within a real historical context, the characters and dialogues are fictional and do not represent factual or documentary accounts. Have you ever wondered what it truly feels like to live inside a giant, pressurized iron lung, deep beneath the crushing weight of the Atlantic? Most of the stories we tell are about the ships that sail under the sun, but today, we descend into the shadows of the gray wolves. To the British sailors on the surface, the U-boat was a ghost, a silent predator that struck from the dark and vanished before the smoke could clear. But to those of us who lived in the belly of a Type 7 boat, it was a world of sweat, grease, and the constant rhythmic ticking of a clock that could stop at any second. We weren't just sailors. We were the hidden blade of a desperate empire, tasked with a mission that was as cold and indifferent as the salt water surrounding us. The fascination with the German U-boat often starts with its sleek, lethal silhouette. But the true story lives in the suffocating silence of a submerged hull during a depth charge attack. My name is a ghost now, but in 1941, I was a young watch officer peering through a salt-encrusted periscope at the vast, lonely stretches of the mid-Atlantic Gap. We called those the happy times, a period when the fascination of the hunt was at its peak and the ocean felt like our private hunting ground. The psychological weight of our mission was immense because we knew that every merchant ship we sent to the bottom was a blow to the heart of the British war machine. We were told we were heroes, the elite hunters of the deep, but inside the boat, the reality was a cramped, stinking tunnel of iron where 40 men shared 2 tiny toilets. The smell of diesel fuel, moldy bread, and unwashed bodies was our constant companion, a reminder that we were living in a metal tomb that breathed only when we allowed it. The secret flaw of the U-boat wasn't in its engines or its torpedoes, but in its absolute reliance on the darkness to hide its fragility from the world above. We were kings of the surface at night, using our low profiles to slip past escorts, but once we were forced to dive, we became slow, blind, and desperately vulnerable. The fascination of the Wolfpack tactics was their terrifying coordination, a symphony of destruction directed by Admiral Donuts from thousands of miles away, using the Enigma code. We would wait in long lines across the shipping lanes, an invisible net of steel waiting for the vibration of a propeller to signal the start of the slaughter. When a convoy was sighted, we didn't attack alone. We gathered in the shadows, whispering to each other across the radio waves like wolves calling out in the forest. It was a calculated, cold-blooded way to fight a war, and for a long time, it seemed like the gray wolves were truly the masters of the Atlantic. I remember the first time we sighted a large convoy, a forest of masts stretching as far as the eye could see against the pale orange glow of a dying sunset. The psychological weight of that moment was electric, a mix of predatory adrenaline and the sharp, jagged fear of the destroyers that we knew were circling the herd. We waited until the moon was obscured by heavy clouds, then we surfaced, our decks awash with icy spray as we moved into position among the lumbering merchant ships. The fascination of the attack was its suddenness, a streak of white bubbles in the dark, a muffled roar, and then a pillar of fire that turned the night into day. We were so close we could see the faces of the men on the burning decks, a sight that stayed with me long after the ship had vanished. There was no glory in the fire, only the grim satisfaction of a job done and the knowledge that the hunt had only just begun for the night. Living on a U-boat meant embracing a unique kind of claustrophobia, where the walls always felt like they were inching closer with every meter of depth we descended. The fascination with the engineering of the Type 7 was undeniable, but as a sailor, you only cared about the thickness of the pressure hull and the sound of the rivets. Every creak and groan of the ship was a language we all learned to speak, a dialogue between our survival and the crushing power of the deep ocean. We slept on top of torpedoes and ate among the machinery, our lives stripped down to the bare essentials of breathing, watching, and waiting for the next order to strike. The psychological weight of being submerged for days at a time changed a man, turning his skin a sickly pale color and making the sunlight feel like an assault on the eyes. We were creatures of the dark, and the boat was the only universe we knew. a vibrating world of brass valves and ticking gauges. The secret flaw of our existence was that we were always one mistake away from being crushed by the very element we used as our primary shield against the enemy. If a valve failed or a weld cracked under the pressure of 200 meters, the ocean would enter with the force of a cannon shot, ending everything in a second. The fascination with the wolf pack was also its greatest danger, as the more we communicated, the more the British listeners on the shore began to triangulate our secret positions. We felt the net tightening around us even during the happy times, as the escorts became faster, their sonar pings louder, and their depth charges more accurate than before. The psychological weight of being hunted is different from the thrill of the hunt. It is a slow, grinding erosion of the nerves that makes every sound a potential threat. We were the masters of the Atlantic, yes, but we were beginning to realize that the ocean was a much larger and more indifferent master than we were. I often think about the men I served with, the silent brothers who moved through the narrow passageways with the practiced grace of people who knew every bolt and shadow. We were a community of the damned, bound together by the secret flaw of our mission and the knowledge that 7 out of every 10 U-boat sailors would never return. The fascination of our success was a hollow thing when you considered the faces of the boys who were replacing the veterans, their eyes wide with a terror they tried to hide. We told them stories of the great aces, of Prien and Kretschmer to keep their spirits up, but the psychological weight of the mounting losses was becoming impossible to ignore. Every time we returned to the bunkers in France, there were fewer boats in the pens and more empty chairs in the mess hall where our friends used to sit. The gray wolves were still biting, but our teeth were being blunted by a world that was learning how to hunt the hunters with a terrifying efficiency. The fascination of the U-boat's bridge during a night surface run was the only thing that kept us sane. The cold wind hitting our faces and the stars guiding our path. It was the only time we felt like real sailors again, breathing the fresh salt air instead of the recycled oily muck that filled the boat when we were submerged. We would stand there in our heavy leathers, scanning the horizon for the telltale silhouette of a lone tanker or the terrifying flash of a destroyer's searchlight. The psychological weight of the darkness was our best friend, a velvet curtain that we pulled around ourselves to escape the eyes of the Royal Air Force. But even the darkness was starting to betray us, as new technologies like radar began to pierce the night, turning our sanctuary into a trap. We were the silent terror, but the world was becoming a place where nothing could remain silent or hidden for very long in the cold Atlantic. The secret flaw of the German strategy was the belief that we could win a war of attrition against an enemy that could build ships faster than we could possibly sink them. The fascination with our tonnage totals blinded the high command to the reality that the tide was shifting, and the gray wolves were being forced into deeper, darker waters. We felt it in the way the depth charges were dropped. No longer just a few, but a relentless rain of explosives that followed us down into the lightless abyss of the sea. The psychological weight of a prolonged hedgehog attack is something that never truly leaves your bones. The sound of the metal projectiles hitting the water above you. We would sit in total silence, the lights turned off to save power, listening to the pings of the Aztec searching for our hull like a blind man feeling for a wall. It was a test of the soul more than the ship, a trial by pressure that broke men long before it ever broke the iron. This was the beginning of the end for the happy times, a transition from the thrill of the chase to the desperate, gasping struggle to survive another day in the deep. The fascination with the U-boat's lethality was being replaced by a grim respect for its endurance, as we pushed our boats far beyond their design limits just to stay alive. We were the gray wolves, and we still had our pride, but the ocean was starting to feel less like a hunting ground and more like a waiting room for the grave. The psychological weight of the war was shifting, and as we looked at the maps of the Atlantic, the gaps where we could hide were shrinking with every passing month. We had set out to strangle the world, but now we were the ones feeling the noose tighten around our necks as we dove into the dark. We were the silent terror of the Atlantic, but the silence was becoming a heavy, permanent thing that threatened to swallow us whole. The secret of the wolf pack lay in our ability to turn the ocean into an invisible battlefield, where the enemy never knew from where the fatal blow would come. The fascinating precision of the coordinated attack system required us to wait, sometimes for weeks on end, in absolute silence beneath the freezing waves of the North Sea. The psychological weight of this waiting was a slow torture, that eroded the nerves of the younger men, turning military discipline into a constant, grinding mental struggle. We felt the vibration of distant cargo ships like a heartbeat that accelerated our own blood, awakening the predatory instinct that life in the iron tube demanded. Every U-boat captain was an artist of destruction, calculating firing angles and target speeds with a coldness that ignored the human fate of the merchant sailors. We were the architects of a naval blockade intended to suffocate an entire nation through hunger and the absolute scarcity of resources vital for its daily survival. The Grey Wolf had no compassion, only a technical mission executed with the precision of a Swiss watch hidden in the darkest and deepest reaches of the ocean. The secret flaw of our group tactics was the vulnerability of the radio transmissions that allowed us to hunt in unison against the massive Allied supply convoys. The fascination with the Enigma machine gave us a false sense of security, an invisible shield of mathematics that we believed was impenetrable to the analysts at Bletchley Park. We were broadcasting coordinates and attack orders into the ether, unaware that every signal was a lifeline that the enemy was beginning to pull and unravel. The psychological weight of being located through our own words was a fear we had not yet named, but felt in the very tips of our shivering fingers. We believed the sea was too vast for us to be found, but triangulation technology was turning our sanctuary of immensity into a detailed and dangerous tactical map. Silence was our only real defense, yet the need to attack as a pack forced us to shout into the night, attracting the stealthy hunters of the escort. We were building our own trap with every coded message sent to Berlin, firmly believing in our technical superiority and the absolute myth of German invincibility. I remember the sensation of emerging in the conning tower during a winter storm, where 10-meter waves seemed to want to crush the submarine's pressure hull. The fascination with the raw force of nature was the only thing that reminded us that we were still men, and not just cogs inside a machine. The psychological weight of maintaining balance on a slippery deck, with freezing water pouring into our boots, was a physical challenge that kept our minds focused. The Grey Wolf was a creature of the surface that only submerged to hide or to deliver the final mercy blow beneath the dark line of the water. Our low silhouette was almost impossible to detect visually amidst the crests of white foam and the dense darkness of the moonless nights in the Atlantic. In those moments of total isolation, we felt that the ocean was our private kingdom and that nothing in the world could stop our relentless forward march. War seemed like a distant abstraction until the radar indicated a new target, returning us to the mechanical and violent reality of naval combat at sea. We were sailors of the abyss living between two worlds, the stormy sky above and the silent depths below where our final fate silently waited. The secret flaw of our daily lives was the slow degradation of mental sanity that occurred when we stayed submerged for over 20 hours to avoid patrols. The fascination with human endurance was tested to the limit when the air became so heavy with carbon dioxide that a match simply would not light. The psychological weight of hearing drops of condensation fall onto the electrical panel was a torment that made us long for the simple touch of sunlight. Every man on the U-boat had to learn to control his own claustrophobia, transforming the cramped space into a sanctuary of routine and rigorous professional duty. The lack of hygiene and rationed food turned the environment into a broth of odors that seeped into our skin and our filthy leather sea clothes. There was no privacy, only the constant sharing of warm bunks and the incessant sound of oxygen pumps trying to keep 40 men breathing and alive. We were voluntary prisoners of a cause that demanded the sacrifice of our humanity, in exchange for the promise of a naval victory that seemed guaranteed. However, the ocean did not accept promises, and the external pressure of the water reminded us constantly that our lives hung by a thin layer of steel. The fascinating sight of a tanker exploding on the horizon was the climax of weeks of exhaustive searching and silent pursuit through the rolling ocean waves. The psychological weight of seeing the fire lick the night sky was compensated by the adrenaline of knowing we had fulfilled our duty to the German Reich. The Grey Wolf did not stop to celebrate, for the explosion served as a beacon that attracted the enemy destroyers with an increasingly lethal and rapid speed. We had to dive quickly, abandoning the scene of the crime while the debris still floated and the survivors screamed for help we could not give. The secret flaw of our conscience was the necessity to suppress any feeling of empathy, so we could continue loading the heavy tubes with lethal torpedoes. We learned to see ships as numbers, tons of steel sent to the bottom to win a war of statistics and raw, industrial, and brutal attrition. Our humanity was an unnecessary cargo that we left at the port whenever the moorings were released and the submarine's nose pointed toward the open sea. We lived for the attack. For the moment, the periscope confirmed the impact, and the sound of the detonation echoed through the metallic hull of the boat. The psychological weight of being hunted by planes equipped with centimeter radar was the radical change that transformed our dominance into a state of constant panic. The fascination with aerial invulnerability ended the moment the depth charges began to fall from the sky without any prior warning or even a visual sighting. The secret flaw of our equipment was the inability to detect these new radio waves, leaving us blind to the threat that came from high above. We were no longer safe at night, as the enemy now had eyes that pierced the darkness and located us before we could submerge in safety. Every patrol became a game of Russian roulette, where luck was the only factor deciding who returned to the base in France for another mission. We felt the circle closing, that the Grey Wolves were being surrounded by a pack much larger and better armed than our own small force. The technology that had given us the initial advantage was now being used to systematically eradicate us from the waters we once proudly governed. Donuts's unshakable confidence began to sound like desperation in the messages arriving through the headsets, asking for more aggression, while we died in silence. The fascinating engineering of the new Type 21 submarines promised a revolution, but for us, stuck in the old Type 7s, the reality was much darker. The psychological weight of knowing we were using obsolete weapons against a modern armada was a burden we carried in silence during our meager meals. The secret flaw was the delay in industrial production that forced us to patch the old hulls with rushed welds and worn-out replacement parts from other boats. We looked at the sea and saw fewer and fewer friendly submarines, a clear sign that the loss rate was outstripping our building capacity. The veterans were disappearing, being replaced by boys who barely knew how to operate the trim valves in case of an emergency or a sudden attack. The Grey Wolf was aging prematurely, its fur stained with oil and its eyes weary of watching a horizon that only brought more destruction. We were no longer the predators of the Atlantic, but rather cunning prey trying to last one more day without being crushed by the pressure. The war of attrition was being won by American shipyards, while we withered away in an increasingly deep, dangerous, and isolated maritime grave. I remember the sound of depth charges exploding above us, a sound that feels like a giant hammer striking a massive bell made of hardened steel. The psychological weight of counting the seconds between explosions is something no military training can prepare for, as the fear is purely and deeply visceral. The fascination with the U-boat structure was taken to the limit when rivets popped and water began to enter in thin, lethal, and high-pressure jets. The secret flaw of our courage was the fact that it depended on the integrity of a machine being hammered mercilessly by a persistent enemy. We sat on the floor, in the dark, hugging our knees, hoping that the next charge would not be the one to open the hull. The water pressure was a silent enemy that took advantage of every crack, every weakness of the metal, to invite us into our final tomb. In those moments, there was no ideology or homeland, only the primitive desire to breathe fresh air and see the daylight one last time. We were the shadows of men, reduced to our most basic state of survival at the bottom of an ocean that did not care. The fascinating irony of our fate was that the deeper we sank into the sea to flee, the closer we came to our eternal resting place. The psychological weight of seeing the depth gauge needle pass the red mark was the final test of trust in the engineer and the steel. The secret flaw of our isolation was that no one in the outside world would know how or where we had found our tragic end. We would be just an entry in the naval records as missing in action, a number lost in a war that was devouring entire generations. We felt the loneliness of the abyss like a cold blanket wrapping around us, isolating us from the families waiting in ports we might never see. The Grey Wolf was being buried alive in a desert of water, without glory, without a marked grave, and without the enemy even seeing our faces. Our war was a fight of ghosts against shadows, where the only proof of our existence was the oil slicks rising to the surface. We were becoming part of the seabed, merging our steel with the sand and the oblivion of the centuries following our inevitable defeat. This was the prelude to Black May, the month when the tide turned definitely, and the hunter became the systematic prey of an irresistible allied force. The fascination with our own legend was dying under the weight of the sinking statistics that clearly showed our imminent defeat in the vast Atlantic. The psychological weight of going out for a patrol knowing the probability of return was almost zero transformed the port farewell into a funeral. The secret flaw of our leadership was the refusal to accept that the submarine war had been won by Allied science and superior logistics. We continued to sail toward death with the rigidity of an automaton, fulfilling orders that no longer made any strategic or tactical military sense. The Grey Wolf was now fighting only for its own honor, a flame that burned dimly before being extinguished by the frozen immensity. We were about to enter the final phase of our existence, where the silence of the ocean would be the only testament to us. The silent terror that almost won the war was now being silenced forever by the force of progress and the vengeance of those we hunted. The secret flaw of the Grey Wolf became obvious when the sky, once our greatest ally in the dark, turned into a deadly and illuminated trap. The fascinating invention of the Lee lights attached to British bombers meant that we could be bathed in a blinding glare at any second of the night. The psychological weight of being snatched from the protective darkness by a spotlight from the clouds was like the final judgment of an angry and vengeful god. We could no longer charge our batteries on the surface with our former confidence, because the centimetric radar had already located us long before we saw them. We were like frightened rats trying to find a hole in the sewer, while a mechanical hawk circled silently above our tired and weary heads. The fascination of the night hunt had been stolen and replaced by the agony of being the prey that has nowhere left to hide in the sea. Allied technology was overtaking our steel, transforming our submarines into iron coffins that glowed under the harsh artificial light of the enemy's superior and relentless science. The psychological weight of living under the constant sound of enemy sonar, the infamous ping that pierced through the hull, was a refined form of slow madness. The fascinating nature of that sound was that it did not just locate us, but it also measured the exact distance to our inevitable and cold death. The secret flaw of our isolation was that we could not respond, only listen as the destroyers maneuvered into the perfect position for a depth charge launch. We stayed motionless, in absolute silence, hearing the footsteps of the enemy sailors above us through the water, a proximity that defied all human logic. Every man on the U-boat held his breath, fearing that the clatter of a tool or a heavy sigh might give away our final and secret position. Time dilated in that damp darkness where seconds felt like hours and every ping was a hammer, striking the very nails of our shared destiny. We were prisoners of our own stealth, hoping that the acoustics of the vast ocean would protect us from a destruction that was mere meters away. The fascination with more powerful weapons led to the development of the acoustic torpedo. But this innovation came loaded with the psychological weight of a terrible failure. The secret flaw was that sometimes the torpedo turned against the very submarine that launched it if we did not dive away fast enough into the deep. Hearing the sound of our own weapon seeking the noise of our own propellers was the height of tragic irony in this mechanized and brutal war. We were creating monsters that did not distinguish between friend or foe, transforming the act of attacking into a risk of technological suicide for the crew. The ocean was becoming a minefield of sound and fury, where the hunter had to be more intelligent than the very weapons he carried into battle. Every launch was a moment of absolute tension, followed by a violent, evasive maneuver to flee from the trail of bubbles we had just created. Submarine warfare had lost its predatory elegance to become a dirty and desperate struggle for the basic mechanical survival of the ship and its men. I remember the first time we saw an escort carrier on the distant horizon, a fascinating sight that signaled the absolute end of our maritime dominance. The psychological weight of knowing that planes could now hunt us in the middle of the Atlantic, where we were once safe, was a devastating blow. The secret flaw of our long-range strategy was exposed by the Allied ability to close the air gap with these small, floating, and effective bases. There was no longer a place to rest, nor a safe zone to organize the wolf packs before a coordinated attack on a heavy merchant convoy. We were attacked while still trying to understand the source of the threat, with rockets piercing our hull before we could even order the dive. The gray wolf was being cornered by birds of prey that never rested, transforming the surface of the sea into a desert of constant danger. Our freedom of movement had been reduced to small periods of terror beneath the waterline, far from the saving light and fresh air. The secret flaw of our crew was the extreme youth of the recruits who arrived, 18-year-old children with the fascination of propaganda still in their eyes. The psychological weight of leading boys who had never seen the sea to an almost certain death was the heaviest burden any captain could carry. They did not know the smell of death in a hit submarine, nor the sensation of seeing oil mixed with the blood of their close friends. We taught them to operate valves and torpedoes, but we could not teach them not to scream when the metal began to groan under pressure. Their innocence was consumed by diesel and fear in less than a week of patrol in the hostile and freezing waters of the North Atlantic. They transformed into pale-skinned old men in a flash, learning to sleep with the sound of distant explosions echoing through their shallow and haunted sleep. We were a generation of living ghosts, driving a war machine that demanded the sacrifice of youth in the name of an impossible victory. The fascinating resilience of the Type 7 hull was the only thing that separated us from an instant crushing by the black and deep depths of the sea. The psychological weight of seeing the paint crack and peel off the walls due to the flexing of the steel was a constant reminder of our fragility. The secret flaw of the design was that we had physical limits that our courage could not change, no matter how desperate we truly were. Every meter we descended to flee from the depth charges was a bet against the structural integrity of the hurried and stressed naval welds. We heard the rivets popping like pistol shots inside the boat, a sound that signaled the metal was reaching its limit and was about to yield. The fight was against the enemy up there and against gravity down here, a combat on two fronts that exhausted our physical and mental energy. The gray wolf was being squeezed by the ocean that was once its hunting ground, becoming a victim of its own former and reckless audacity. The psychological weight of seeing the oil rise to the surface after an attack was our only way of communicating our defeat to those left behind. The fascinating and terrible beauty of an iridescent stain on the gray sea was all that remained of a submarine and its entire human crew. The secret flaw of our existence was that there were no bodies to bury, nor monuments to mark the exact spot where we fell and died. We were swallowed by the blue, leaving behind only bubbles of air and the eternal silence of a grave without a name or a date. Families at home waited for letters that would never arrive, trapped in the cruel fascination of a hope that had no real or solid foundation. Each loss was a black hole in our formation, an empty chair at the port that no one dared to occupy for fear of bad luck. We were disappearing from the face of the earth one by one, while the world continued to spin without even noticing our silent and cold departure. The fascinating technology of the schnorchel allowed us to breathe and operate diesel engines while submerged, but it brought its own psychological weight and deadly dangers. The secret flaw of this ventilation tube was that if a wave covered it, the engine sucked the air from inside the submarine instantly. Our lungs felt the pressure drop suddenly. Our eardrums almost burst and panic spread as the oxygen disappeared from the cramped command cabin. It was an exercise in physical torture that allowed us to stay hidden, but at the cost of debilitated health and constant and draining stress. The gray wolf was now an animal that breathed through a straw, hiding at the bottom of the tank to avoid the hunter's sharp eyes. We were no longer the bold predators who attacked on the surface, but miserable survivors who tried not to suffocate from their own defense technology. War had become a matter of air filters and waste management, far from the glory of the classic and heroic naval battles. The psychological weight of intercepting Allied communications and realizing that they knew exactly where we were was the ultimate betrayal of our trust in Enigma. The fascinating breaking of the code meant that every move of ours was anticipated by a warm reception of depth charges and patrol planes. The secret flaw of our military intelligence was believing that we were the only ones capable of mastering the complex mathematics of war cryptography. We were being led to the slaughter like cattle, following orders that the enemy had already read and planned how to intercept with lethal efficacy. The sensation of being watched by invisible eyes transformed every patrol into a journey of paranoia and absolute distrust toward the high command. The gray wolf was blind, while the hunter had a divine vision over the entire chessboard of the North and South Atlantic Ocean waters. Our audacity had turned into futility, and every attack we attempted was met by a barrier of steel that was already waiting for us. This was the end of hope and the beginning of the acceptance that the Grey Wolf was condemned by Allied science and superior war logistics. The fascinating saga of the submarines was entering its darkest chapter, where individual bravery could no longer balance the massive industrial and scientific scale. The psychological weight of continuing to fight a lost war was the final test of the character and desperation of the German sailors. The secret flaw of the entire submarine campaign was the underestimation of the human capacity to adapt and overcome terror through unity and technology. We were approaching the final collapse, where the silence of the seafloor would be the only companion left for us in the very end. The Grey Wolf was tired, wounded, and alone, awaiting the moment when the last battery would fail, and the ocean would reclaim us. The silent terror that almost won the war was now being devoured by the very sea it tried to conquer with so much blood. The secret flaw of our world of steel became unbearable when electricity, the very blood of our machines, began to fail systematically under the enemy's relentless attacks. The fascinating dance of the needles on the voltage meters was now a constant descent toward total darkness and the icy silence of the deep. The psychological weight of knowing that every light that flickered out brought us closer to a tomb without oxygen was a shadow that devoured hope. We were no longer the bold hunters of the past, but prisoners of an iron tube that grew colder with every passing hour of the hunt. Moisture condensed on the freezing walls, mixing with sweat and oil to create an atmosphere of despair that one could almost chew and swallow. We were living inside a clock that was slowly stopping, where the mainspring had been cut by the technological progress of a tireless enemy. The Grey Wolf was now paralyzed, its metal claws unable to find any traction in an ocean that had finally become a vast prison. The fascinating and terrible routine of silent running meant that no one could move, speak, or even change position to avoid making any acoustic noise. The psychological weight of sitting in the dark, listening to the metal groan under the pressure, transformed strong men into statues of absolute and pure terror. The secret flaw of the silence was that it amplified every internal sound, from the beating of a heart to the rhythmic drip of condensation. We imagined the enemy hydrophones up there, like giant ears scouring the water for the smallest mistake that could condemn us all to death. Our existence was reduced to the capacity to not exist at all, to become part of the rock and sand on the seafloor. Every minute in this immobility was an eternity of mental suffering, where sanity was tested by the lack of air and the cold fear. We were ghosts of steel, floating in a limbo where the only certainty was that the world outside had forgotten our names and faces. The fascination with the U-boat bunk was a grim joke among the crew, as we shared beds that never had time to get cold. The psychological weight of sleeping in the scent of another man's sweat and the lingering odor of diesel was a constant assault on the soul. The secret flaw of our intimacy was that we knew each other's fears better than we knew our own families waiting back in the port. There was no escape from the collective anxiety of 40 men trapped in a space smaller than a modest house, underwater and under fire. We watched the faces of our comrades grow hollow and pale, their eyes sunken by the lack of sunlight and the presence of death. The boat was a living organism, and we were the cells that were slowly dying off as the mission dragged on into the void. It was a community of the damned, bound together by the steel and the salt, waiting for a signal that would never come again. I remember the secret flaw of our food supplies, where fresh bread turned into a green, moldy mass within just a few days of sailing. The fascination with the luxury of a hot meal disappeared as we were reduced to eating canned meat that tasted of nothing but metal. The psychological weight of malnutrition and the constant dampness made our skin break out in painful salt sores that would never heal in the dark. We were rotting from the inside out. Just like the Empire, we were desperately trying to defend with our remaining and aging torpedoes. Every bite was a reminder of the world we had left behind, a world of green fields and fresh air that now felt like a dream. The Grey Wolf was hungry, but the ocean offered nothing but salt and the bitter taste of a defeat that was approaching fast. We were the elite, they told us, but we felt like the discarded scraps of a war that had moved far beyond us. The psychological weight of the depth-charge shiver is a sensation that stays in a sailor's bones until the day he finally returns to dust. The fascinating way the boat would bounce and skip in the water from the shock waves was like being trapped inside a giant ringing church bell. The secret flaw was that you could never get used to it. Every explosion was a new, raw terror that threatened to snap your mind. We watched the gauges vibrate and the light bulbs shatter, leaving us in a red-tinted emergency glow that felt like a bloody and dark omen. We gripped the pipes and the valves, praying that the welds would hold against the invisible hammers of the British and American destroyers. In those moments, the fascination of the hunt was gone, replaced by the primitive, animalistic desire to just keep breathing for one more minute. The gray wolf was being beaten into submission by a superior force that had finally learned how to kill the silent shadows. The fascination with our enigma victory was a hollow echo now, as we realized that every one of our secrets was an open book. The psychological weight of being betrayed by our own technology was the ultimate secret flaw that ensured our total and inevitable destruction in the sea. We were ordered to move to new quadrants only to find the enemy already there, waiting with their guns loaded and their sonar pings sharp. It was a feeling of profound nakedness, as if the walls of the submarine were made of glass and the whole world was watching. We stopped trusting our radios, stopped trusting our orders, and eventually, some of us even stopped trusting the man standing right next to us. The gray wolf was being led by a blind shepherd, walking straight into the muzzles of 1,000 waiting and vengeful Allied cannons. Our pride was the only thing we had left, but pride is a poor shield against a depth charge that knows exactly where you are. The secret flaw of the U-boat's air was the slow buildup of oil mist and battery acid fumes that burned our throats and stung our eyes. The fascination of the technology was overshadowed by the physical reality of living in a chemical haze that made every breath a painful chore. The psychological weight of knowing that our own boat was slowly poisoning us added to the tension of the enemy's hunt on the surface. We coughed into our hands and saw the black soot of the engines, a mark of the machine that was both our home and our coffin. There was no such thing as a clean breath, only varying degrees of foul air that kept us on the edge of a slow, suffocating panic. The gray wolf was gasping for air, but the surface was a place of fire and iron that we could no longer easily reach. We were the masters of the deep, but the deep was a place where nothing was ever meant to live for very long. I often think about the secret flaw of our letters home, which were censored and sanitized to maintain the fascination of the heroic and brave warrior. The psychological weight of writing to a mother or a wife while knowing you were likely never to see them again was a special torture. We talked about the weather and the food, never mentioning the sharks, the depth charges, or the sound of the hull being crushed. We lived a double life, one in the letters and one in the leaking, stinking reality of the Atlantic's cold and unforgiving graveyard. The fascination of the hero was a mask we wore for the people we loved, but beneath the mask we were just terrified boys. The gray wolf was a symbol of strength for the propaganda posters, but in the dark, it was just a lonely and dying animal. We were writing our own epitaphs in the margins of those letters, hoping that someone would remember who we were before the sea. The psychological weight of the endless night was the most fascinating part of the late war patrols, where the sun never seemed to actually rise. The secret flaw was that we lost track of days and weeks, our biological clocks shattered by the artificial red light of the boat. We became creatures of the dark, our eyes sensitive to the smallest flicker of a dial, and our ears tuned to the hum. The fascination of the world above, the blue sky, the white clouds, the sound of birds, was a distant memory that felt fake. We were part of the machine now, our rhythms tied to the rotation of the shafts and the ticking of the torpedo clocks. The gray wolf had no day or night, only the cycle of the hunt and the cycle of the hiding in the deep. We were becoming the very shadows we moved through, fading away before the war had even officially come to its final end. This was the state of the U-boat force as 1943 bled into the final, desperate years of the conflict in the Atlantic and beyond. The fascination with our early victories was a bitter taste in our mouths, a reminder of a time when the wolves were the kings. The psychological weight of the secret flaw was now a crushing reality that dictated every move we made in the cold and dark. We were sailing toward a horizon that was perpetually on fire, in boats that were held together by little more than hope. The gray wolf was wounded, its pack scattered to the winds and the currents of the ocean floor where so many stayed. We were the silent terror, but the silence was now our own, a quiet acceptance of the fate that was waiting in the deep. The story was reaching its final chapter, and we were the last characters left to witness the closing of the iron and salt. The secret flaw of the U-boat war reached its breaking point in May 1943, a month we now remember as Black May. The fascination with the Grey Wolf's dominance vanished in a matter of weeks as 41 of our boats were destroyed in the Atlantic. The psychological weight of losing nearly a boat every single day was a shock that broke the spirit of the remaining pack. We realized that the ocean was no longer our hunting ground, but a vast graveyard where we were the primary and only residents. The fascination of the struggle was replaced by a grim mechanical movement toward a defeat that was now mathematically certain for us. Every time we surfaced to breathe, we were met with a storm of steel that forced us back into the dark. The Grey Wolf was no longer a hunter. It was a ghost trying to outrun the dawn in a world of ice. The silence of the radio was the most terrifying sound of all, as more and more voices simply stopped. The fascination with the secret flaw of our design reached its final chapter when the order for Operation Regenbogen was whispered through the fleet. The psychological weight of being told to scuttle our own boats was a betrayal of everything we had endured in the deep. We were ordered to sink the very homes that had protected us from the crushing pressure and the enemy's relentless and loud sonar. The fascination of the machine was stripped away as we opened the valves and watched our beloved boats vanish beneath the waves. It was a funeral for an era, a silent and bitter end to the terror that had almost brought a world to its knees. We stood on the shore and watched the oil slicks form, knowing that our war was over. But our memories were not. The Grey Wolf was finally at rest, but the scars on our souls were permanent and would never truly heal or fade. We were the men of the abyss, and we were finally returning to a world that didn't know how to speak our language. I often think about the secret flaw of the memory of the U-boat, which is often reduced to just a simple and cold statistic. The fascination with the numbers, the millions of tons sunk, hides the reality of the 30,000 boys who never saw the sun again. The psychological weight of that loss is a shadow that hangs over the history of the Atlantic like a thick and heavy fog. We were the most decorated branch of the German military, but we also paid the highest price in blood and in human life. The fascination of the Grey Wolf remains a part of naval lore, a symbol of a technology that was as lethal as it was tragic. But to those of us who were there, it was never about the glory. It was about the air we shared. We were bound by the steel, and we were broken by the silence of the sea that claimed so many of us. The story of the U-boat is a story of the human spirit pushed to the very edge of the impossible. The fascination with the secret flaw of our survival is that we are the living witnesses to a world that no longer exists. The psychological weight of being the last ones to remember the smell of the diesel and the sound of the depth charges is heavy. We walk through the modern ports and see the massive container ships, unaware of the ghosts that lie beneath their very paths. The fascination of the ocean is its ability to hide the wreckage of the past, to wash away the blood and the oil. But for us, the Atlantic is never empty. It is a crowded place filled with the echoes of our youth and our fears. We are the survivors of the silent terror, the men who lived in the dark so that the world could learn the price of war. The Grey Wolf is a legend now, a silhouette in a history book, but the heart of the wolf still beats in us. We carry the silence with us, a permanent part of who we are and what we have become over time. The secret flaw of history is that it often forgets the losers, yet the U-boat story is one the world cannot stop telling. The fascination with our tactics and our technology continues to inspire books, films, and the imagination of those who study the sea. The psychological weight of our legacy is a complicated mix of respect for our skill and horror at the destruction we caused. We were the masters of an invisible war, a conflict that took place in a dimension that most people will never see. The fascination of the silent terror is a reminder that the greatest threats are often the ones you cannot see coming. We were the ghosts of the Atlantic, and though our boats are now rust and coral, our presence is still felt in every wave. The story of the Grey Wolf is a cautionary tale about the power of the machine, and the fragility of the man. We were the edge of the sword, and we were the first to be blunted by the stone of history. I remember the secret flaw of the post-war years, where we had to learn how to live in the light and the noise. The fascination with our past was something we often kept hidden, a secret we shared only with those who had also been in the deep. The psychological weight of the U-boat stare, that distant, haunted look in a veteran's eyes, was a common sight in our small reunions. We talked about the boats as if they were people, remembering the quirks of the engines and the way the hull groaned. The fascination of our bond was that it was forged in a place where no one else could follow us or understand. We were a brotherhood of the abyss, a group of men who had seen the worst of humanity and the best of each other. The gray wolf was a lonely animal, but it was never alone as long as the pack was still breathing and remembering. We found peace in the quiet, but the silence of the ocean was always there, waiting for us to return. The fascination with the secret flaw of the wreckage found today is the way the sea has claimed our boats as its own. The psychological weight of seeing a diver touch the conning tower of a sunken U-boat is a strange and moving experience for us. We see the guns covered in barnacles and the hatches sealed shut, holding the secrets of a crew that died in the dark. The fascination of the iron coffin is now a site of pilgrimage for historians and those who seek to understand the war. We are grateful that they are being found, that the names of the missing in action are finally being given a place to rest. The gray wolf is no longer a threat. It is a monument to a time of madness and a testament to the endurance of steel. Every boat found is a story recovered, a piece of the puzzle that was the Battle of the Atlantic in the deep. We watch the footage from the depths and we see ourselves, young and pale, waiting for the end. The secret flaw of the U-boat story is that it is ultimately a story of the failure of technology to replace the human soul. The fascination with the machines often distracts us from the reality that it was the men who fought, suffered, and died in them. The psychological weight of the war in the Atlantic is a burden that should be shared by all who value the peace we have now. We were the silent terror, but the true terror was the silence of a world that had lost its way and its heart. The fascination of our journey is a lesson in the dangers of the blind pursuit of power and the importance of the human connection. We were the gray wolves, but we were also sons, fathers, and brothers who were caught in a tide that was too strong. The story of the U-boat is a reflection of the darkness that exists in all of us and the light we find together. We are the last of the pack, and our final mission is to make sure the world remembers the cost of it all. The fascination with the end of the gray wolf is that it didn't end with a bang, but with a quiet and somber surrender. The psychological weight of seeing the black flags flying from our masts as we entered the Allied ports was a moment of profound defeat. The secret flaw was that we were still alive while so many of our brothers were at the bottom of the cold sea. We walked away from the boats and left the silent terror behind, but the ocean stayed in our blood and in our dreams. The fascination of our life in the deep is a treasure we carry, a secret that belongs only to the few who survived. We look at the horizon and we don't see a barrier. We see a home, a place where we once ruled and where we were lost. The gray wolf is a shadow in the water, a memory that will linger as long as the tides continue to turn. We are the old men of the sea, and our watch is finally coming to its long-awaited and peaceful end. If the silent struggle of the gray wolves and the haunting reality of life inside a U-boat has moved you, please consider subscribing. We are dedicated to bringing these deep-sea legends and the men who lived them back to the surface for a new generation. The fascination with the Atlantic War is more than just a history lesson. It is a tribute to the human spirit in the dark. Comment below. Do you believe the U-boat was the most terrifying weapon of the war, or was the ocean itself the true enemy? Share your thoughts on the legacy of the gray wolves and help us keep these stories from fading into the abyss. Your support allows us to explore the secret flaws and the hidden heroisms of the world's most famous and tragic vessels of war. Thank you for diving with us today into the history of the deep and the silent terror of the sea. For those who remain in the depths, we remember you, and we leave the light on for your final return home.